"Daddy, why did you leave me?" said the abandoned girl, but a millionaire saw her and did something shocking. Watch until the end. Comment telling me what you thought of this story, with a rating from 0 to 10. I really want to know if you liked my story, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The March morning hung heavy over Asheville, with grey clouds that seemed to carry the weight of the world. In the central town square of the mountain city, between the weather-worn wooden benches and the trees swaying in the cold wind, a sound echoed that cut through the air like a sharp blade. It was the cry of a child, but not just any cry of a tantrum or fleeting fear. It was something much deeper, more desperate. "Daddy, why did you leave me? Daddy, why did you leave me?" The words came from the small mouth of a girl of only 4, her dirty, wrinkled clothes a painful contrast to the innocence of her round face. Ruby walked in circles in the center of the square, repeating that question as if it were a mantra of pain, her bare feet treading on the uneven, historic cobblestones. Passers-by hurried past, some casting curious glances, others completely averting their gaze, as if ignoring the scene could make it disappear. It was an ordinary Thursday, and life went on at its normal pace for everyone, except for that small figure lost in the middle of the urban hustle. It was then that the sound of screeching brakes shattered the morning routine. A black Mercedes-Benz stopped abruptly on the side of the square, and out of it stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing an impeccable grey suit. Arthur Vance, at 52, was an imposing presence in Asheville. The owner of Vance Artisanal Furniture, one of the most respected factories in the region, he carried the natural authority of someone who had built an empire from scratch. But at that moment, all his business posture crumbled when he heard those words repeated by the child. "Daddy, why did you leave me?" The sound hit his chest like a clenched fist, awakening memories he had struggled to keep buried for 3 long years. Memories of his own daughter, Isabel, then 6, asking the same thing when Eleanor, his ex-wife, simply disappeared with the girl after a divorce that turned into a war. Arthur approached the child slowly, his steps measured and careful. Ruby continued her circles, oblivious to his presence, lost in her world of abandonment and confusion. Her small hands clutched a dirty piece of cloth, probably all that was left of some toy or blanket that had once brought her comfort. "Hello, little one," Arthur said, crouching down to her level. "What's your name?" Ruby stopped for a moment, her large, dark eyes meeting his. For a moment, it seemed she would break out of the trance she was in, but then she resumed her circular walk, repeating the same question with renewed intensity. "Daddy, why did you leave me? Daddy, why did you leave me?" The situation drew the attention of a few people who began to gather around. An elderly woman commented to her companion, "She must have run away from somewhere. A child isn't left alone like this for no reason." A merchant selling newspapers on the corner approached, shaking his head regretfully. "Mr. Vance, this girl appeared here at dawn." The news vendor, a thin man in his 60s, informed him, "I've tried talking to her, but she won't stop repeating that thing about her father. It's like she's in another world." Arthur observed the child more closely. There was something familiar about that face, something that stirred a deep part of his soul. Perhaps it was the extreme vulnerability, perhaps it was the way she moved, as if she were searching for something she would never find again. It was exactly how he had felt since he lost contact with Isabel. "Do you know where she came from?" Arthur asked the news vendor. "From what I've heard from some folks, she was at Ms. Finch's shelter over in the Pine Ridge district. Seems she ran away during the night. Nobody knows how she managed to get out of there and make it all the way here." The name Janice Finch was known throughout Asheville, but not necessarily for good reasons. The 45-year-old woman had been running the municipal shelter for over 2 decades, and although it was officially a child protection institution, many rumors circulated through the city about the conditions in which the children were kept there. Arthur felt a knot in his stomach. If this girl had run away from a shelter, it meant her situation was even more complicated than he had imagined. But something inside him, a force he couldn't explain, prevented him from simply calling the authorities and handing the child back to the system. "Ruby," he said, testing the name he had heard a woman whisper as she passed. The girl stopped again, this time for longer, as if the sound of her own name had some magical power over her. "Is your name Ruby?" Arthur insisted, extending his hand towards her. The girl looked at his outstretched hand, then at his face, and for a brief moment her expression changed. The anguish gave way to a childlike curiosity, as if she were trying to decide if she could trust this stranger in an elegant suit and with a gentle voice. "Daddy went away," she said finally, but this time without the desperate tone from before. It was a simple, painful statement, but uttered with the brutal honesty only young children possess. "I know what that's like," Arthur replied, surprised by his own honesty. "My little girl went away too, not by her choice, but she did." Ruby tilted her head as if processing the information. Then, for the first time since Arthur had seen her, she took a step towards him, extending her small, dirty hand to touch his. The contact was electric. Arthur felt a wave of emotions he had suppressed for years. The need to protect, to care, to be a father again. But with it also came fear, uncertainty, and the question he didn't want to ask himself. What would he do with this child who clearly needed help? "Do you want to come with me?" he asked, knowing he was making a decision that would change everything. "I have a place where you can be safe." Ruby nodded, her fingers intertwining with his, with a trust that was heartbreaking. It was as if she recognized in him something she had lost, an anchor in the sea of abandonment she was navigating. As they walked towards the car, Arthur couldn't stop thinking about the irony of the situation. 3 years ago, he had lost his daughter to the whims of a vengeful ex-wife. Now, an abandoned child appeared in his life, as if fate were trying to give him a second chance at being a father. But at the same time, a concern grew in his chest. Janice Finch was not known for tolerating interference in her domain. If she found out Arthur had taken one of her children, she certainly wouldn't stay quiet. And there was something in Ruby's eyes, a fragility that went beyond normal abandonment, that told him this girl carried secrets and pains he couldn't even imagine yet. As the Mercedes-Benz pulled away from the central square, carrying a lonely businessman and a lost child, neither of them knew that their lives were about to become complicated in ways they could never have imagined, and that this cloudy March morning marked only the beginning of a journey that would test the limits of love, redemption, and the courage of 2 wounded souls in search of healing. Arthur's mansion in Biltmore Forest stood majestically among well-tended gardens and high walls that ensured total privacy. It was an imposing 3-story structure, with an architecture that blended classic colonial with modern touches, the result of years of business prosperity and a refined taste for the beautiful. But on that afternoon, all the grandeur of the property seemed small compared to the fragility of the girl walking beside him. Ruby held Arthur's hand tightly as she climbed the marble steps of the main entrance. Her big eyes scanned every detail of the environment with a mixture of fascination and fear, as if she couldn't believe that such a beautiful place could exist in the same world where she had known only pain and abandonment. "This is your home now," Arthur said, opening the carved mahogany door, "at least for now." The interior of the mansion was even more impressive. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, fine wood furniture filled the spacious rooms, and carefully selected works of art adorned the walls. Everything breathed elegance and comfort, but also a deep loneliness that echoed through the silent corridors. Ruby let go of Arthur's hand and took a few hesitant steps into the entrance hall. Then, without warning, she began again with her repetitive words, "Daddy, why did you leave me?" "Daddy, why did you leave me?" Her voice echoed off the marble walls, creating a painful contrast between the opulence of the surroundings and the desperate simplicity of her pain. Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He had imagined that bringing her to a safe and comfortable environment would be enough to calm her, but he now realized that Ruby's problems were much deeper than a simple matter of shelter. "Let's see if you like your room," he said, trying to divert the girl's attention. He picked her up carefully, surprised by how light she was for a 4-year-old. It was as if she carried only bones and sadness. The room he chose for her was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the back gardens. It was spacious and bright, decorated in pastel tones that Mariana, his late wife, had chosen years ago when they dreamed of having more children. The irony was not lost on him. Ruby timidly explored the room, touching the soft bedspread, running her fingers over the stuffed animals that were still arranged on the shelves. For a few minutes, she seemed like a normal child, curious and delighted with the new things. But then reality hit her again, like a wave, and she began to repeat her anguished question. It was at that moment that the mansion's doorbell rang insistently. Arthur went downstairs, leaving Ruby exploring the room, and found a middle-aged woman standing outside the electronic gate. Even through the intercom, he immediately recognized who it was. Janice Finch. Janice was 45 and had a posture that intimidated most people. Tall and thin, with graying hair always tied in a tight bun, she wore simple but impeccably pressed clothes that gave her an air of severe authority. Her small, piercing eyes seemed capable of seeing through lies, and her mouth was constantly pursed in an expression of disapproval. "Mr. Vance," she said through the intercom, her voice laced with controlled coldness, "I need to speak with you about a very serious matter." Arthur hesitated for a moment. He knew exactly why she was there, but he wasn't prepared to face that conversation so soon. "One moment," he replied, opening the gate and walking to the entrance of the property. "I imagine you know why I'm here," Janice said bluntly, her eyes scanning the facade of the mansion with a poorly disguised expression of displeasure. "One of the children under my care disappeared this morning. Ruby Marsh. I have reason to believe you know where she is." "And what makes you think that?" Arthur asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the tension he felt growing in his chest. Janice smiled, but there was no warmth in her expression. "Asheville is a small city, Mr. Vance. News travels fast, especially when it involves a wealthy businessman picking up an abandoned child in the central square. The girl was alone, clearly in danger," Arthur replied, feeling his patience begin to wear thin. "Any decent person would have done the same thing. Any decent person would have contacted the proper authorities," Janice retorted, taking a step forward. "They wouldn't have just taken a child home as if she were a lost pet." The comparison infuriated Arthur, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. "Ruby is safe and well cared for. That's what matters." "What matters," Janice said, raising her voice slightly, "is that this child is a ward of the state, and you committed a crime by removing her from my custody." At that moment, as if summoned by the mention of her name, Ruby appeared at the mansion's door. She had come down the stairs on her own and was now standing at the entrance, watching the conversation with her big, frightened eyes. Upon seeing Janice, her small body visibly stiffened, and she took a step back. "Daddy, why did you leave me?" she began again, but this time the words came out in clipped fragments, as if Janice's presence had awakened painful memories. Janice looked at the girl with an expression that mixed irritation and something Arthur couldn't quite identify, but that seemed dangerously close to contempt. "Ruby," she said in a firm voice, "stop this nonsense and come here immediately. You've caused a lot of trouble today." The child's reaction was immediate and devastating. She began to shake her head frantically, her small fists clenching, and her words turned into a desperate scream. "No! Daddy, why did you leave me? Daddy, why did you leave me?" Arthur saw the terror in Ruby's eyes, and something inside him broke. All the doubts he'd had about his decision to help her vanished instantly. He placed himself between the child and Janice, his broad shoulders completely blocking the woman's view. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice low but filled with a determination that brooked no argument. "At least not until I'm sure she'll be well treated." Janice laughed, but the sound was anything but joyful. "You have no idea what you're getting into, Mr. Vance. This girl isn't some charity project. She has problems. Serious problems you are not equipped to handle." "What kind of problems?" Arthur asked, turning slightly to look at Ruby, who had hidden behind his legs and continued repeating her question in an increasingly distressed tone. "Neurological deviations," Janice said with cruel indifference. "Compulsive repetition, episodes of agitation, resistance to authority. That's why she was isolated from the others at the shelter. That's why no one wants to adopt her." Janice's words hit Arthur like a shocking revelation. It explained a lot about Ruby's behavior, but it also raised new concerns. He knew nothing about caring for a child with special needs. But looking at the small figure clinging to his legs, he felt that it didn't matter. All that mattered was that she needed him. "That doesn't change anything," he said finally. "She stays with me." Janice studied his face for a long moment, and Arthur could see the gears turning in her mind. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on a threatening tone. "Very well, Mr. Vance. I see you're determined, but let me be clear. I do not tolerate interference in my work. This situation could become very complicated for you if you're not careful." With those words, she turned and walked back to her car, a small, poorly maintained white sedan that contrasted sharply with Arthur's Mercedes. But before getting into the vehicle, she turned one last time. "Oh, and Mr. Vance, this child's father didn't abandon her by chance. Elias Marsh worked for you, didn't he, at your factory? Maybe you should investigate the story more thoroughly before you get in any deeper." Janice's words echoed in Arthur's mind as she drove away, leaving him with more questions than answers. Elias Marsh. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't connect it to any specific face among the many employees he had employed over the years. Ruby had stopped repeating her question and was now looking at him with an expression of mute gratitude that broke his heart. He picked her up again, feeling her light physical weight, but also the immense emotional weight of the responsibility he had taken on. As they went back inside the mansion, Arthur couldn't know that on the other side of town, a woman was about to receive news that would change everything once again. Eleanor Vance had just arrived in Asheville after a 3-year absence, bringing with her not only luggage, but also a fierce determination to reclaim the life she had lost. Eleanor Vance's arrival in Asheville that night was like a storm that approaches silently before devastating everything in its path. She drove a silver Honda Civic with a few dents in its body, clear evidence of the financial troubles that had forced her to leave Chicago. At 42, Eleanor still retained the beauty that had captivated Arthur 2 decades earlier, but now there was a hardness in her green eyes that hadn't existed in the past, marks left by years of bitterness and resentment. She parked in front of the city's most modest hotel, a simple establishment far from the tourist center that cost a fraction of what she used to spend on lodging. As she carried her single suitcase through the dimly lit lobby, Eleanor tried not to think about how she had reached this point. 3 years ago, she was the wife of a prosperous businessman living in an elegant mansion without a care in the world about money. Now she was broke, desperate, and back in the city she had sworn never to set foot in again. The reason for her return was simple. She had exhausted all other options. The risky investments she had made in Chicago had not only consumed all the money she had received in the divorce, but had also left her in debt to people who would not accept excuses for much longer. Returning to Asheville and trying to win back Arthur was her only hope for survival. But what Eleanor didn't expect was to discover through casual conversation with the hotel receptionist that her old life had been disturbed by something completely unexpected. "Mr. Vance is taking care of a little child now," the woman commented as she handed over the room key. "A little girl he found abandoned in the square. It's the sweetest thing to see, a man like that taking care of a little one." The words hit Eleanor like a punch to the gut. Arthur taking care of a child. The man she had deprived of contact with his own daughter was now exercising the fatherhood she had denied him. The irony was cruel, and at the same time, it presented an opportunity she hadn't considered before. That same night, as Eleanor planned her strategy in the small, poorly ventilated hotel room, Arthur faced his first major challenge as Ruby's caregiver. The girl had woken up screaming in the middle of the night, not just repeating her usual question, but thrashing violently in bed as if fighting invisible enemies. "Daddy, why did you leave me? Mummy, where are you? Daddy, why did you leave me?" She screamed between sobs, her small fists punching the air. Arthur tried to calm her, but any attempt to touch her only intensified her agitation. It was during this nightly crisis that he realized the true extent of Ruby's neurological problems. It wasn't just compulsive repetitions during moments of stress. There was something much more complex happening in her small, wounded mind. She seemed to be reliving specific traumas, as if her mind were stuck in a loop of abandonment and pain. After 2 hours of trying to calm the child, Arthur finally managed to get her to fall asleep again, but the episode left him deeply worried. For the first time since he had brought Ruby home, he began to question whether he was prepared to handle her special needs. The next morning, while Ruby slept soundly, exhausted from the night's episode, Arthur decided to investigate more about Elias Marsh, the girl's father who had worked at his factory. He went down to his private office and began to review employee files from the past few years. It was then that he found Elias's file, a 28-year-old man who had worked as a machine operator for about 2 years, between 2019 and 2021. His performance reviews were mediocre, with several warnings for unexcused absences and punctuality problems. What caught Arthur's attention the most was the reason for his termination: job abandonment after an argument with his supervisor about family responsibilities. The file also mentioned that Elias had repeatedly requested salary advances, citing urgent family problems. At the time, Arthur had authorized some of these advances, but now he wondered if he should have paid more attention to the employee's personal problems. As he examined the documents, his phone rang. It was Mr. Montgomery, his personal lawyer, returning the call Arthur had made early that morning. "Arthur, I got your message about the child situation," the lawyer said, his voice filled with professional concern. "I need to be blunt with you. What you did could be interpreted as kidnapping a minor, especially if the child was an official ward of the state." "She was abandoned in the square, Montgomery. Anyone would have done the same thing." "Anyone would have called the proper authorities," the lawyer replied, echoing Janice Finch's words. "Look, I understand your intentions, but legally you're in a very delicate situation. You need to regularize this immediately." Arthur explained about the conversation with Janice and his suspicions about the conditions at the shelter. Montgomery listened in silence before responding. "If you have doubts about the treatment the child received at the shelter, that can be used in your favor, but we need to document everything properly. I'll start the process for an emergency temporary guardianship, but it will require psychological evaluations for both you and the child." "Do whatever is necessary," Arthur said without hesitation. I won't return Ruby to that woman until I'm sure she'll be safe. After hanging up, Arthur went upstairs to check on Ruby. He found her awake, sitting on the bed, looking out the window at the gardens. She seemed calmer than the night before, but there was a deep melancholy in her eyes that broke his heart. "Good morning, little one," he said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Daddy went away," she replied, but this time not in the form of an anguished question. It was a simple statement, filled with a sadness too mature for a 4-year-old. "Sometimes daddies go away," Arthur said, choosing his words carefully, "but that doesn't mean you're not special. It just means they got lost." Ruby looked at him with her large, dark eyes, as if she were trying to process the information. "Are you going to go away too?" The question hit Arthur like a direct arrow. "I won't. I promise." But even as he made that promise, he knew it wasn't entirely in his hands to keep it. The legal complications, the threats from Janice, and now the discovery about Elias Marsh created a complex scenario that could force him into decisions he didn't want to make. It was in this moment of vulnerability that Eleanor chose to make her first move. She had spent the morning observing the mansion from a safe distance, studying the movements and planning her approach. When she saw Arthur go out with Ruby for a walk in the gardens, she decided it was time to introduce herself. Arthur was teaching Ruby how to feed the fish in the ornamental pond when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and felt as if he had seen a ghost. Eleanor was there, just a few feet away, wearing a simple blue dress that highlighted her green eyes, a cautious smile on her lips. "Hello, Arthur," she said, her voice filled with a mix of nervousness and determination. "Are you okay?" For a moment, Arthur was speechless. 3 years of anger, pain, and resentment clashed with memories of past love and happiness. Ruby, sensing the tension in the air, hid behind his legs, quietly repeating her familiar question. "Eleanor," he finally managed to say, "what are you doing here?" "I came home," she replied, taking a cautious step towards them, "and I heard that you're taking care of a child." Eleanor's eyes fixed on Ruby, and for an instant, Arthur saw something that surprised him. It wasn't just curiosity or calculation, but something that seemed genuinely maternal. But he knew Eleanor too well to trust first impressions. "This is Ruby," he said, placing a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. "And yes, I'm taking care of her." "She's beautiful," Eleanor said, crouching down to the child's level. "Hi, Ruby. My name is Eleanor." Ruby looked at her with suspicion, but didn't start her compulsive repetition, which Arthur took as a good sign. "Arthur," Eleanor continued, straightening up, "can we talk alone? There's a lot we need to discuss." Arthur hesitated. Part of him wanted to send Eleanor away immediately, protecting himself from all the pain she represented. But another part, the part that still carried 3 years of unanswered questions, was curious about what she had to say. "Ruby, how about you go play on the swing?" he suggested, pointing to the equipment in the corner of the garden. "I'll watch you from here." The girl nodded and walked towards the swing, but Arthur noticed she kept her eyes fixed on them, as if she feared he would disappear if she didn't pay attention. "Talk," he said to Eleanor, crossing his arms. "What do you want?" "I want to apologize," she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded sincere. "For everything, for taking Isabel, for stopping you from seeing her, for destroying our family." The words caught Arthur off guard. In all the scenarios he had imagined for an eventual reunion with Eleanor, he had never considered that she might start with an apology. "Why now?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Why, after 3 years, do you show up here apologizing?" Eleanor lowered her eyes, and when she raised them again, Arthur saw tears forming. Because I made the biggest mistake of my life. And because I need help. The raw honesty in her voice completely disarmed him, but before he could respond, a sharp cry echoed from the other side of the garden. Ruby had fallen from the swing and was on the ground, not just crying from pain, but having another compulsive episode, repeating her question while rocking back and forth. Arthur ran to her, followed by Eleanor, and as they knelt to help the child, their hands touched for an instant. It was a brief contact, but one laden with an emotional complexity that neither of them was prepared to face. Ruby's episode in the garden was different from all the previous ones. This time, in addition to the compulsive repetition, she began to have mild seizures, her small body trembling uncontrollably as her eyes rolled back. Arthur picked her up, feeling panic rise in his chest, while Eleanor watched the scene with a look of genuine horror. "We need to get her to the hospital," Eleanor said, all her calculated composure vanishing in the face of the medical urgency. "Right now." Arthur didn't hesitate. He carried Ruby to the Mercedes, with Eleanor running behind, and sped towards St. Joseph's Hospital, the only decent medical facility in Asheville. During the journey, which normally took 15 minutes, he managed to do it in 8, driving with desperate skill through the narrow streets of the historic city. Ruby had stopped convulsing, but she continued to repeat her question in a tone that grew increasingly weak, as if her strength were fading. Eleanor sat in the back seat, holding the girl's hand and whispering words of comfort that surprised even herself with their sincerity. At the hospital, Ruby was immediately taken to the pediatric emergency room, where an experienced medical team took over her care. Arthur and Eleanor were left in the waiting room, in a tense silence that only the shared fear for a child in danger could create between them. It was then that a woman approached them. Dr. Clementine Reed was 38, with a confident yet gentle demeanor, and brown eyes that radiated professional competence mixed with genuine compassion. She wore a white lab coat over a light blue blouse and carried a clipboard with detailed notes. "Mr. Vance?" she asked, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Clementine, a pediatric neuropsychologist. I've been examining Ruby." "How is she?" Arthur asked immediately, rising from the uncomfortable waiting room chair. "Physically, she's stable. The seizures have stopped, and we haven't identified any acute neurological damage. But I need to talk to you both about her condition." Dr. Reed led them to a private office, where they sat in chairs arranged in a semicircle. The psychologist opened Ruby's file and began to explain what she had discovered during the examination. Ruby presents a complex picture that combines severe post-traumatic stress disorder with repetitive behaviors that may be related to the autism spectrum. The abandonment she suffered, combined with possible previous mistreatment, has created a neurological defense pattern that manifests through compulsive repetitions. "Is there a cure?" Eleanor asked, surprising both the doctor and Arthur with her seemingly genuine concern. "It's not a matter of a cure, but of treatment and adaptation," Dr. Reed explained. "With proper therapy, love, patience, and a stable environment, children like Ruby can lead completely normal lives, but the process is long and requires total dedication from the family." "She has no family," Arthur said, his voice heavy with sadness. "Her father abandoned her. Her mother disappeared. She was in a shelter until you brought her home," the doctor completed. "Yes, the social worker informed me of the irregular situation. Mr. Vance, I need to be frank. Ruby needs emotional stability above all else. Any abrupt change in her environment could trigger even more severe episodes." And at that moment, the office door opened and Janice Finch entered unceremoniously, followed by a short, chubby man who identified himself as Dr. Barton, the doctor responsible for the psychiatric evaluation of minors at risk. "Dr. Reed," Janice said in her cold voice, "I've come to pick up Ruby Marsh. Mr. Vance has no legal authority to keep her in his care." The tension in the room instantly escalated. Arthur stood up, his fists clenched, while Eleanor watched the interaction with growing interest. Dr. Reed, however, remained calm and professional. "Ms. Finch, as the doctor responsible for the child at this moment, I cannot authorize her removal until she is completely stable. Furthermore, I would like to review the conditions in which she was being kept before this episode. The child was perfectly fine under my supervision," Janice replied, but something in her voice revealed nervousness. "These episodes are common in children with her particularities." "Common?" Dr. Reed questioned, flipping through some pages in her file. "There are no medical records of psychological or neurological follow-up in the shelter's files. How could a child with such obvious special needs not be receiving adequate treatment?" Dr. Barton, who had remained silent until then, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, resources are limited, and it's not always possible." "It's not a matter of resources," Dr. Reed interrupted, her voice taking on a firmer tone. "It's a matter of medical negligence. This child should have been diagnosed and treated months ago." Janice and Dr. Barton exchanged nervous glances. It was clear they hadn't expected to face medical questioning about their practices. Arthur realized an opportunity was opening up. "Doctor," he said, "if Ruby needs stability, wouldn't removing her from the environment where she feels safe now be detrimental?" "Absolutely," Dr. Reed confirmed. "Any sudden change could trigger even more severe episodes. In my medical opinion, the child should remain in the environment where she has shown the most emotional stability until a proper treatment plan is established." It was at this moment that Eleanor made a move that surprised everyone. "And what if there were adequate family supervision?" she asked, looking directly at Arthur. "Could a couple offer better support than a single man?" The suggestion caught Arthur completely off guard. He immediately understood what Eleanor was doing, using Ruby's situation to insert herself back into his life. But before he could protest, Dr. Reed responded, "The ideal would be a stable family unit, yes, but the most important thing is the emotional bond the child has already established. Changes in the family configuration also need to be gradual." Janice, realizing she was losing control of the situation, decided to play her strongest card. "Mr. Vance, you might be interested to know that we've found Ruby's mother." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone present looked at Janice, waiting for more information. "Joanna Marsh is working in a garment factory in the city center. She was not aware that her daughter had been removed from her father's care." Janice's words created a new, complex dynamic in the room. If Ruby's biological mother was alive and in the city, it would completely change the legal issues surrounding the girl's custody. "Where has she been all this time?" Arthur asked, his voice filled with a mix of hope and apprehension. "According to our information, she left the city 4 months ago, believing that Elias would properly care for the child. She only learned of her daughter's abandonment yesterday when our team located her." Dr. Reed frowned. "And why wasn't she contacted immediately when the child was taken to the shelter?" Dr. Barton cleared his throat again. "There were complications in locating the legal guardians." "Complications or negligence?" the doctor pressed, her professional patience beginning to wear thin. At that moment, a nurse entered the room. "Dr. Reed, the girl is awake and asking for Uncle Arthur." The information struck everyone like a bolt of lightning. Ruby had created a specific emotional connection with Arthur, referring to him using a term of family endearment. For Dr. Reed, this was clear evidence of the bond that had formed. "I need to see my daughter," said a new voice from the door. A woman of about 25 had appeared at the office entrance. She was thin, with disheveled brown hair and simple work clothes. Her eyes, the same dark color as Ruby's, were red from crying. "Joanna?" Janice asked, clearly surprised by the woman's unexpected arrival. "Where is my Ruby?" Joanna asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "They said she's in the hospital, that she had seizures. Please, I need to see her." The situation had become extremely complex. There were now multiple parties claiming rights or responsibilities over Ruby. Arthur, who had developed an emotional bond with her, Janice, representing the state, Joanna, the biological mother, and Eleanor, who was trying to insert herself into the situation for her own reasons. Dr. Reed took control of the situation with medical authority. "You all need to understand one thing. Ruby's well-being comes first. Any decision about her custody must be made gradually, with full psychological follow-up. For now, she will remain under medical observation." "For how long?" Joanna asked, tears streaming down her face. "For as long as it takes to ensure that any transition is made without causing her more trauma," the doctor replied firmly. Meanwhile, in a room a few meters away, Ruby was awake, staring at the white hospital ceiling and quietly repeating, "Uncle Arthur, are you coming to get me? Uncle Arthur, are you coming to get me?" She didn't know that her simple question had become the center of a battle that would determine not only her future, but also the fate of all the adults whose lives she had touched so unexpectedly and profoundly. The meeting between Joanna and Ruby was a moment no one in the room was prepared to witness. When Dr. Reed finally allowed the mother to see her daughter, accompanied by all the other involved parties, what happened defied all expectations. Ruby was sitting on the hospital bed, distractedly playing with a teddy bear a nurse had given her when she saw Joanna enter the room. For a long moment, mother and daughter stared at each other in absolute silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, Ruby tilted her head and asked, "Are you my mommy?" The question, asked with the brutal innocence of a 4-year-old, struck Joanna like an arrow to the heart. She approached the bed slowly, tears streaming freely down her thin face. "I am, my love," she managed to say, her voice choked. "I'm your mommy." But Ruby's reaction was not what Joanna had expected. Instead of running into her mother's arms, the girl retreated slightly and began her familiar repetition. "Daddy, why did you leave me? Mommy, why did you go away? Daddy, why did you leave me?" Joanna sat on the edge of the bed, struggling to control her emotions. "My love, Mommy didn't want to go away. Mommy was sick. Very sick in the head." Dr. Reed observed the interaction with professional attention, taking notes on both of their reactions. It was evident that Ruby recognized Joanna on some level, but the months of abandonment had created a complex emotional barrier. "Ruby," Joanna said, cautiously extending her hand, "do you remember our song, the one Mommy used to sing to help you sleep?" The girl stopped repeating her questions and looked at Joanna with curiosity. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she began to hum a soft, childish melody that clearly carried deep memories. "Little bird flew, 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 looking for a love so true." Ruby sang in her small voice, and Joanna joined her, their voices blending in a harmony that spoke of bonds that time and pain had not managed to completely break. Arthur felt a tightness in his chest as he witnessed that moment. It was undeniable that a real connection existed between mother and daughter, but it was also evident that Ruby had changed, had developed new bonds and defense mechanisms. It was at this delicate moment that Eleanor decided to intervene. "Joanna," she said, her voice taking on a tone of social authority she knew well, "where have you been all these months? How could you abandon your daughter?" The cruel, direct question made Joanna flinch, her face flushing with shame and anger. Dr. Reed immediately signaled for Eleanor to be quiet, but the damage was done. "I did not abandon my daughter," Joanna replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was sick, very sick. After Ruby was born, my head, it didn't work right. I saw things that weren't there. I was afraid I would hurt her. The doctor said it was severe postpartum depression. She paused, looking at Ruby, who had gone back to repeating her questions, agitated by the tension in the room. Elias said he would take care of her while I got treatment. He said it was temporary, that when I got better, we could be a family again. And you believed him? Arthur asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the outrage he felt. I was desperate, Joanna replied, the tears returning. I was afraid of hurting my own daughter. I thought I was doing the right thing. Janice, who had remained silent observing the interaction, finally decided to take control of the situation. Well, now that the biological mother has been located, the issue of custody is resolved. Ruby will return with Joanna. It's not that simple, Dr. Reed interrupted firmly. Joanna, have you received adequate treatment for your condition? Do you have medical follow-up? The financial and housing conditions to care for a child with special needs? The doctor's questions made Joanna lower her head. I work in a garment factory. I don't make much, but enough for the two of us. I live in a small, rented room, but it's clean. And the psychiatric treatment? The doctor insisted. I don't have money for a private doctor and the public health clinic. The waiting list is too long. Dr. Reed exchanged glances with Arthur. The situation was becoming increasingly complex. Joanna clearly loved her daughter and wanted to care for her. But her financial limitations and lack of proper treatment created real risks for Ruby. Uncle Arthur, Ruby said suddenly, extending her arms towards him. Will you stay with me? The child's simple request created a moment of palpable tension in the room. It was clear that Ruby had developed a significant bond with Arthur, but the presence of her biological mother greatly complicated the situation. Arthur approached the bed and took Ruby's small hand. I will always be here for you, little one, no matter what happens. It was then that Joanna did something that surprised everyone. Instead of showing jealousy or resentment, she looked at Arthur with genuine gratitude. Thank you, she said simply, for taking care of my daughter when I couldn't. The moment of mutual understanding between Joanna and Arthur was interrupted by the abrupt entrance of Mr. Montgomery, Arthur's lawyer, accompanied by another man whom no one recognized. Arthur, Mr. Montgomery said, clearly agitated, I need to speak with you urgently. There are developments in the situation you need to know about. But the man accompanying him introduced himself as Elias Marsh, Ruby's father. He was thin, of medium height, with dark hair and eyes that avoided direct contact. His clothes were wrinkled, and he smelled of alcohol, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. I've come for my daughter, Elias said, his voice slurred. I heard she's here. The change in Ruby was immediate and terrifying. Upon seeing her father, she began to scream in a way no one had witnessed before. It wasn't just her compulsive repetitions, but pure screams of terror, as if she were reliving specific traumas linked to his presence. No! Bad Daddy! Bad Daddy went away! No! She screamed, thrashing on the hospital bed with a surprising strength for such a small child. Joanna immediately placed herself between Elias and her daughter, her maternal instincts finally fully awakened. Get out of here, she shouted. You see what your presence does to her? She's my daughter as much as she is yours, Elias retorted, but it was evident that Ruby's reaction had shaken him. Dr. Reed took medical control of the situation. Everyone out of the room now, except for you, Joanna, and you, Mr. Vance. Ruby needs to calm down. Janice and Elias were forced to leave, along with Eleanor and Mr. Montgomery. In the room, only the people Ruby had shown acceptance for remained, her biological mother and the man who had become her de facto father figure. Gradually, with Joanna humming the childhood song and Arthur holding her hand, Ruby began to calm down. But the episode had revealed something disturbing. There were specific traumas linked to Elias's presence that went far beyond simple abandonment. "Dr. Reed," Joanna said in a low voice, "I need to know. Was my daughter, was she hurt by him?" The question no one wanted to ask had finally been asked. Dr. Reed looked at Ruby, who had fallen asleep, exhausted from the emotional episodes, and made a professional decision. "I'm going to request a full evaluation, psychological and physical. We need to know exactly what happened to this child during the months she was in her father's custody and later at the shelter." From the hospital corridor, they could hear raised voices. Elias was arguing with Mr. Montgomery about paternal rights, while Janice tried to reassert control over the legal situation. Eleanor remained silent, observing and calculating how she could use the chaos to her advantage. But inside the room, an unlikely alliance was forming between Joanna and Arthur. Both had been touched by Ruby's vulnerability, both wanted to protect her, and both were beginning to understand that the solution for the girl's well-being might require sacrifices and decisions neither of them had considered before. "Mr. Vance," Joanna said hesitantly, Can I ask a question?" "Of course. Why do you care so much about my daughter? You haven't known her for even a week." Arthur looked at the sleeping Ruby, her little face finally at peace after so much suffering. "Because she reminded me of something I had lost, and because every child deserves to have someone fight for them." The simple words carried a weight that Joanna understood instinctively. In that moment, she knew she had found not only someone who would care for her daughter, but someone who genuinely loved Ruby for who she was, with all her traumas and special needs. What none of them knew was that outside the hospital, decisions were being made that would make the fight for Ruby's well-being even more complex and dangerous. Ruby's full medical evaluation took 3 days, during which she remained in the hospital under intensive care. Dr. Reed personally conducted each exam, from physical analyses to detailed psychological assessments, always in the presence of Joanna or Arthur, the only people whose proximity did not trigger traumatic episodes in the child. The results were both devastating and enlightening. Ruby showed no signs of severe physical abuse, but there was clear evidence of severe neglect and psychological trauma. More disturbingly, the doctor discovered that many of the girl's repetitive behaviors had intensified during her stay at Janice's shelter. "The shelter's medical records are extremely deficient," Dr. Reed explained during a meeting on the 3rd day, gathering Joanna, Arthur, and Mr. Montgomery in her office. "There is no proper documentation of Ruby's mental state when she arrived, nor records of any treatment or follow-up during the 4 months she was at the institution." "Is that illegal?" Arthur asked, his voice filled with controlled outrage. "Not just illegal, but criminally negligent," Mr. Montgomery replied, "especially considering that Ms. Finch received specific funding for the treatment of children with special needs." Joanna, who had spent the 3 days practically living at the hospital, looked at Ruby sleeping in the bed beside her. In the last few days, she had witnessed not only her daughter's traumatic episodes, but also moments of lucidity and affection that gave her hope. "Doctor," Joanna said hesitantly, can she get better? Can she have a normal life?" "With the right treatment, unconditional love and stability, yes," Dr. Reed replied with conviction, "but it will be a long process. She'll need specialized therapy, possibly medication, and above all, a structured and safe family environment." It was at this moment that Elias appeared at the office door, accompanied by a man in a suit who introduced himself as his lawyer, Mr. Pereira. Elias seemed more sober than in previous days, but his eyes still avoided direct contact with anyone in the room. "I've come to exercise my paternal rights," he announced, his voice trying to sound firm, but revealing nervousness. "Ruby is my daughter, and I want custody back." The transformation in the room was immediate. Joanna rose from her chair like a cat ready to pounce, while Arthur involuntarily clenched his fists. But it was Dr. Reed who responded with medical authority. "Mr. Marsh, as the doctor responsible for the case, I cannot authorize direct contact between you and Ruby. Your presence triggers severe traumatic episodes in the child." "This is absurd," Mr. Pereira protested. "My client has not been formally charged with any crime. He has legal rights over the child, and I have medical responsibility for her," Dr. Reed retorted firmly. "Any decision on custody must prioritize the child's well-being." At that moment, Ruby woke up to the sounds of the argument. Seeing Elias through the glass door of the office, she immediately started screaming, "Bad daddy, bad daddy! I don't want to, I don't want to." The girl's screams echoed down the hospital corridor, causing nurses to come and check what was happening. Elias visibly recoiled, clearly shaken by his daughter's reaction. "She's being influenced against me," he muttered to his lawyer. "Someone is putting these ideas in her head." Joanna could no longer contain herself. "No one needs to put any ideas in her head. You abandoned our daughter. You left her with that horrible woman at the shelter and disappeared." "I was going through a hard time," Elias protested. "I lost my job. I had no way to support you both." "Then why didn't you come to me?" Joanna shouted, tears of anger streaming down her face. "Why didn't you say you were having trouble? We could have found a solution together." The argument was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of Janice, accompanied by two social workers Arthur didn't recognize. She carried a bulky folder and wore an expression of determination that admitted no obstacles. "Dr. Reed," Janice said, completely ignoring the others present, "I'm here to inform you that the municipality has decided to transfer Ruby to a specialized institution in Hendersonville. There she will receive more appropriate care for her condition." The announcement dropped like a bomb in the room. Dr. Reed frowned, clearly surprised by the sudden decision. "Ms. Finch, as the responsible physician, I was not consulted about this transfer. Moreover, removing Ruby from the environment where she has shown stability would be extremely detrimental." "The decision is not medical. It's administrative," Janice replied coldly. "The child needs specialized care that neither the biological family nor other interested parties can provide." "The other interested parties" was said with a direct look at Arthur, making it clear that Janice considered his interference the main problem. It was then that Mr. Montgomery revealed information that completely changed the dynamic of the situation. "Ms. Finch, you might be interested to know that my office has received anonymous tips about financial irregularities at the municipal shelter. Apparently, there are significant discrepancies between the funds received and the expenses declared for the children." Janice visibly paled, but tried to maintain her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about. My administration is transparent and audited." "Audited by whom?" Mr. Montgomery asked, opening his own folder. "Because according to documents we've obtained, audit reports haven't been submitted for over 2 years." The revelation created a moment of palpable tension. Elias and his lawyer exchanged nervous glances, while the social workers accompanying Janice seemed genuinely surprised by the information. At that moment, Eleanor appeared in the corridor carrying flowers and a calculated smile. She had been absent for the past few days, but it was clear she had used the time to plan her next move. "How is our little Ruby?" she asked in a syrupy voice, trying to enter the office. "Our?" Joanna questioned, her voice filled with suspicion. "Well, Arthur and I are discussing future possibilities," Eleanor replied, casting a significant glance at her ex-husband. Perhaps it's time to rebuild our family, and Ruby could benefit from having a structured, adoptive family. The suggestion infuriated Arthur. It was obvious Eleanor was trying to use Ruby's situation to regain her social and financial standing. But before he could protest, something unexpected happened. Ruby, who had calmed down when Elias left her line of sight, suddenly looked directly at Eleanor and said something no one expected. "Are you the wicked lady in the story?" The child's innocent question created a moment of awkward silence. It was as if, in her simplicity, Ruby had seen through all the manipulations and identified exactly who posed a real threat to her safety. Eleanor tried to laugh off the situation, but her discomfort was evident. "What an imagination! Of course I'm not wicked, dear." "Mommy," Ruby said, turning to Joanna, "can I stay with Uncle Arthur? He makes me feel safe." The child's simple question cut through all the legal and bureaucratic complexities, getting to the heart of the matter. Where did Ruby truly feel safe and loved? Joanna looked at her daughter, then at Arthur, and made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, Would you help me take care of her?" The question wasn't about giving up custody, but about creating a partnership to ensure Ruby had everything she needed, the love of her biological mother and the resources and stability Arthur could offer. Janice immediately protested. "This is irregular. There is no legal precedent for this type of arrangement." "Yes, there is, Mr." Montgomery replied, smiling for the first time in days. "It's called extended family or non-conventional shared custody. Perfectly legal when approved by the judiciary and when it prioritizes the child's well-being." As the legal discussion continued, Ruby had fallen asleep again, her small hand simultaneously holding Joanna's and Arthur's. It was a symbolic image of how a traumatized child could perhaps find healing through an unconventional yet genuinely loving family. What none of them knew was that Janice had already taken desperate measures to maintain control of the situation, and that in the coming days, the fight for Ruby's well-being would become much more dangerous and complex. Ruby's discharge from the hospital was scheduled for the next morning, but Janice had no intention of waiting for a judicial decision on the new family arrangement. During the night, she had mobilized an operation she believed was her last chance to maintain control of the situation and, more importantly, protect her own interests. At 5 in the morning, 3 white vans positioned themselves strategically around St. Joseph's Hospital. Janice had convinced the on-duty judge, Judge Silverman, that there was a medical emergency and a risk to the child's physical integrity. What the magistrate didn't know was that Judge Silverman had been receiving a discreet financial consultancy from Janice for years to facilitate processes related to the municipal shelter. Arthur had arrived early at the hospital to pick up Ruby, accompanied by Joanna, who had slept in her daughter's room for the 3rd consecutive night. They found a scene that immediately alarmed them. Private security guards blocking the hallway, nervous nurses whispering among themselves, and an atmosphere of tension that cut the air like a blade. "What's going on?" Arthur asked the head nurse, an experienced woman he had gotten to know during the days of hospitalization. "Court order for the immediate transfer of the child," she replied in a low voice, avoiding eye contact. "It arrived an hour ago. We can't interfere." Joanna ran to Ruby's room and found her daughter awake, frightened by the strange movements and unfamiliar voices in the hallway. "Mommy, what's happening?" the girl asked, her big eyes reflecting the growing fear. "Don't worry, my love," Joanna said, trying to keep her voice calm as her heart pounded. "Mommy will handle everything. Ma?" It was then that Janice entered the room, accompanied by 2 social workers Arthur didn't recognize and a court officer carrying official documents. "Mr. Vance, Ms. Marsh," Janice said in a carefully controlled voice, "I regret to inform you that there have been changes in the legal situation. Ruby will be immediately transferred to a specialized institution where she will receive proper care. What institution? Arthur asked, his voice low but filled with a dangerous fury. The St. Teresa Support Home in Hendersonville. It specializes in children with special neurological needs. Joanna instinctively placed herself between Janice and the bed where Ruby was sitting. I won't let you take my daughter away from me again. Ms. Marsh, you have neither the financial nor the structural means to properly care for a child with Ruby's special needs. One of the social workers replied, reading from a report. The decision is for the minor's well-being. And me? Arthur asked. I have the financial and structural means. Why can't I have temporary custody? The court officer cleared his throat before answering. Sir, you are not related to the child, and there are no legal ties that justify custody. The law prioritizes specialized institutions in these cases. At that moment, Ruby began to understand that something was very wrong. She looked at the strangers in the room, at the fear on her mother's face, and at the tension in Arthur's body. Then, she began her repetition, but this time with a desperate intensity. I don't want to go, Uncle Arthur, Mommy, I don't want to go. The sound of Ruby's screams echoed down the hall, alerting Dr. Reed, who had arrived early to oversee the discharge. She stormed into the room, her medical authority cutting through the bureaucratic tension. What is happening here? She demanded, observing Ruby's agitated state. This child was stable. Any transfer procedure should have been discussed with me first. Doctor, we have a court order, Janice said, showing the documents. Dr. Reed quickly examined the papers and frowned. This order was issued based on what medical evaluation? I'm the physician responsible for this case, and I provided no report recommending a transfer. The evaluation was done by Dr. Barton, Janice replied, but there was nervousness in her voice. Dr. Barton is not a neurologist or a child psychiatrist. He is not competent to evaluate this specific case, Dr. Reed retorted with authority. As the medical and legal argument intensified, something unexpected happened. Eleanor appeared in the room with Mr. Montgomery and another man who introduced himself as D.A. August Riley, a public prosecutor specializing in children's rights. I beg your pardon for the interruption, D.A. Riley said, showing his identification, but I am here to investigate serious allegations of irregularities at the municipal shelter and possible corruption involving irregular transfers of minors. The silence that followed was deafening. Janice visibly paled, while the social workers accompanying her exchanged nervous glances. What kind of allegations? The court officer asked, clearly uncomfortable with the turn the situation was taking. D.A. Riley opened a thick folder. Misappropriation of funds intended for childcare, forgery of medical documents, bribery of public officials, and the irregular transfer of children to private institutions that pay commissions for each minor referred. The accusations hit Janice like an avalanche. She tried to maintain her composure, but her hands were visibly shaking as she held the transfer documents. This is absurd, she managed to say. These are baseless accusations from people who want to harm me. They are accusations based on documents, D.A. Riley corrected, pulling several folders from his briefcase, including bank statements showing payments from the St. Teresa Support Home to your personal account for the last 2 years. The revelation sent a shockwave through the room. Even the social workers accompanying Janice seemed genuinely surprised by the information. Joanna, who had been holding Ruby throughout the discussion, finally exploded. You were selling children. My daughter was a product to you. It's not like that, Janice protested, but her voice had lost all its previous authority. I receive a legitimate administrative fee for each successful transfer. Administrative fee? Dr. Reed questioned with indignation. We are talking about traumatized children, not merchandise. At that moment, a nurse ran into the room. Dr. Reed, there are reporters in the lobby. Someone leaked information about corruption at the municipal shelter. The news of the press's presence sent Janice into a full-blown panic. She tried to leave the room quickly, but D.A. Riley stopped her. Ms. Finch, you cannot leave the hospital until I conclude my preliminary investigation. There are search and seizure warrants being executed at the shelter and your residence at this very moment. It was then that Eleanor made a revelation that surprised everyone. I provided the documents to the prosecutor, she said, looking directly at Arthur. I found evidence of the corruption when I was investigating ways to help Ruby legally. Arthur looked at her with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Why? Because, Eleanor said, her voice choked with emotion, I saw what this child means to you, and I saw how you've changed since she came into your life. If helping her means winning back the man I loved, then that's what I'm going to do. Eleanor's confession created a moment of emotional silence in the midst of the legal chaos. Ruby, who had stopped screaming when she realized the bad men weren't going to take her away, looked at all the adults around her with her big, wise eyes. "Mommy," she said to Joanna, "can I stay with you guys now?" The child's simple question cut through all the legal and bureaucratic complexities. Riley looked at Dr. Reed, who nodded firmly. Until this investigation is concluded and the irregularities are resolved, the prosecutor said, Ruby will remain under supervised family care. The specific arrangement will be determined after a full psychosocial evaluation. Janice was taken away for questioning, accompanied by the social workers who were now potential witnesses rather than collaborators. The court officer cancelled the transfer order, acknowledging it had been obtained through false information. When the room finally fell quiet, only Ruby, Joanna, Arthur, Dr. Reed and Eleanor remained. The girl had calmed down completely and was now playing with the teddy bear, as if the whole legal storm had been just a passing nightmare. "And now?" Joanna asked, looking at Arthur with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Now," Dr. Reed said with a smile, "you learn to be a family, not a traditional family, but a real one." Ruby looked up and for the first time in days asked a different question. "Can I have two homes, one with Mommy and one with Uncle Arthur?" The child's innocent question offered a solution no adult had considered. Perhaps healing wouldn't come from traditional structures, but from multiplied and shared love. 6 months after the events at the hospital, life in Asheville had found a new, complex but surprisingly harmonious rhythm. The city's Winter Lights Festival was in full swing, filling the historic streets with music, colors, and the aroma of traditional sweets. For Ruby, now 5, it was her first real experience with community celebrations, and her eyes sparkled with fascination as she watched the folk performances in the central square, the same square where Arthur had found her months before. The family arrangement that had emerged was unique, but it worked. Ruby spent 3 days a week with Joanna in a small but cozy apartment that Arthur had helped furnish, and 4 days at the mansion in Biltmore Forest. Dr. Reed supervised the transition and conducted weekly family therapy sessions that had become fundamental to everyone's progress. "Uncle Arthur, look!" Ruby shouted, pointing to a group of clog dancers in traditional Appalachian attire. Her language had developed dramatically, and although she still repeated phrases occasionally when anxious, the compulsive episodes had become rare and manageable. Arthur smiled, picking her up so she could see the performance better. Beside him, Joanna filmed with her phone, documenting every special moment of her daughter's life. The relationship between them had evolved from a partnership forced by circumstance to a genuine friendship based on their shared love for Ruby. "Mommy, did you see how they dance?" Ruby asked, reaching her arms out to Joanna, who received her with affection. "I did, my love. How about you learn to dance too? The suggestion made the girl's eyes sparkle even more. During the months of therapy, Dr. Reed had recommended artistic activities as a form of emotional expression, and Ruby had shown a natural talent for music and movement. It was in this moment of simple happiness that Arthur received a call that would change everything once again. The name on the screen made his heart race. It was Isabel, his biological daughter. "Excuse me," he said to Joanna, moving a few feet away to answer. "Hello? Dad." The voice on the other end was hesitant, more mature than the last time he had heard it. "It's me, Isabel." Arthur felt his legs weaken. 3.5 years of complete silence, and now his daughter was calling. "Isabel, my daughter, how are you? Where are you?" "I'm fine, Dad. I'm in Chicago with Mom, but I heard about everything. About the girl you're taking care of, about Mom stopping me from talking to you, about everything." Arthur looked at Ruby, who was playing with Joanna near a cotton candy stand, and felt a complex emotion take over his chest. "How did you find out?" "Mom told me. She said she had lied to me, that you hadn't abandoned me. She said you tried to find me, but she wouldn't let you." Isabel's words revealed that Eleanor had finally fulfilled her promise of honesty. After the events at the hospital, she had left Asheville again, but not before making one last revelation. Isabel had always wanted to talk to her father, but Eleanor had fabricated an elaborate story about Arthur losing interest in his daughter. "Dad, can I come visit you? I want to get to know you again, and I want to meet Ruby." The question hit Arthur like a wave of pure emotion. His biological daughter wanted to meet the child who had become his daughter of the heart. It was a poetic symmetry he had never imagined possible. "Of course you can, my daughter. Whenever you want, you will always be welcome." After hanging up, Arthur stood still for a few minutes, processing what had happened. Joanna, sensing his emotion, approached with Ruby. "Did something happen?" she asked, concerned. "It was Isabel, my biological daughter. She wants to come visit." Ruby, with her characteristic sensitivity, looked at Arthur and asked, "Is Uncle Arthur happy or sad?" "Both, little one. Sometimes you can feel both at the same time." It was Joanna who asked the question on everyone's mind. "And how will it be, with Isabel here?" Arthur looked at the two people who had become his world in recent months. "It will be a bigger family, if you want it to be." The answer came through Ruby's actions. She took Arthur's hand and Joanna's and said, "More people to love. That's good." A week later, Isabel arrived in Asheville. At 9 years old, she was a tall girl for her age, with her mother's green eyes, but the smile Arthur remembered from his own childhood. The reunion was both emotional and awkward, laden with 3 years of forced absence and unexpressed expectations. Ruby, who had been carefully prepared by Dr. Reed for the arrival of her big sister, watched everything with intense curiosity. When Isabel bent down to greet her, Ruby asked a direct question. "Are you going to stay?" "I'm staying for a few days," Isabel replied, looking at her father. "If everyone wants me to." "I want you to," Ruby said simply, and offered her older sister her favorite teddy bear, the most generous gesture she knew how to make. During Isabel's 2-week visit, something magical happened. The two girls formed an unexpected connection. Isabel, mature beyond her years due to her difficult experiences, showed a natural patience with Ruby's special needs, and Ruby, in turn, offered her older sister the simplicity and unconditional love she had lost during the years of family manipulation. "Dad," Isabel said on the eve of her departure, Can I come live here? For good." The question was asked during dinner with Joanna and Ruby present. Arthur looked around the impromptu table in his mansion, seeing faces that had become fundamental to his happiness. "And your mother? What does she think?" "Mom said the decision is mine. She's moving to a small town in upstate New York, to Grandma's house. She said she needs to find herself, to discover who she is without all the bitterness." Joanna, who had remained silent during the conversation, finally spoke. "Ruby would be very happy, and so would I." And so, at the end of August, the unconventional family found its final configuration. Isabel moved permanently to Asheville, sharing Ruby's room in the mansion on the days the younger girl stayed with Arthur. Joanna maintained her independence, but became an integral part of the family dynamic, often dining at the mansion or hosting everyone in her apartment. Janice Finch was sentenced to 3 years in a low-security prison for corruption and child neglect. The municipal shelter was completely overhauled, and Dr. Reed was invited to supervise the new psychological care protocols. Elias, confronted with the evidence of his abandonment and Ruby's clear rejection, chose to voluntarily relinquish his legal paternity, allowing Arthur to begin the official adoption process. During the Winter Lights Festival the following year, exactly 1 year after the day it all began, Arthur watched his 2 daughters play in the same square where he had found Ruby. Isabel was teaching her younger sister the steps of a folk dance, while Joanna chatted with other mothers about the school performance that would take place the following week. "You did the right thing," said Dr. Reed, who had joined him to watch the scene. Over the months of treatment, she and Arthur had developed a friendship that was slowly evolving into something deeper and more significant. "We all did," he replied. "Ruby taught us that family isn't about blood or legal documents. It's about choosing to love and continuing to love, even when it's hard." Ruby ran up to him, her hair flying in the cold mountain wind. "Uncle Arthur, look what I learned," she said, doing an imperfect but joyful pirouette. "Beautiful, little one. Are you happy?" Ruby stopped and looked around, seeing Isabel, Joanna, Dr. Reed, and finally Arthur. Her smile was radiant when she answered, "I'm home." The simple answer from a child who had known abandonment, trauma, and pain, but who had found healing through multiplied love and courageous choices, echoed through the historic square of Asheville as an affirmation of hope. Sometimes the most beautiful families are those born not from chance or tradition, but from the conscious decision of imperfect people to choose to love a child who needs healing. And sometimes, in the process of healing a child, the adults discover that they were broken too, and that they were also being healed. As the sun set over the mountains surrounding Asheville that festival afternoon, it illuminated not just a historic city, but also a family that had learned that true love always finds a way, even through the most unlikely and painful circumstances. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story with a rating from 0 to 10. And thank you very much.